Yeah, thank you. Can we, okay, people, can I have your attention, please? All right. Wow, very good. Good morning and welcome. Welcome to you, of course, first of all, our own students, and also welcome to all the people who are watching this lecture from abroad. Good morning. Welcome to the latecomer. It is virtual, but it's still very real. Come on in and find a place somewhere in the back. I don't know if any people are watching. Suzanne? 12 people. Okay, great. Well, welcome to the 12 anonymous people who are also watching this lecture. I'm still trying to sort of find out where I have to look in order to give the impression I'm looking at you, but, well, I'll probably find my bearings at some point. A couple of sort of instructions about this virtual lecture. First to our own students, so I'm just going to talk to them first. As I told you last week, because it's a virtual lecture, it's being captured online. It's very important that you remain very quiet. If there's a lot of murmurs and noise, it's very hard for the people abroad to listen in. That's one thing. Another thing is if you have questions, and I really hope you do have questions, and I have no doubt that you will have questions. The procedure is a little different. Once you raise your hand, you'll have to wait a couple of seconds to get a microphone because if you want your question to be heard by the people online, it has to be transmitted via the microphone. Okay, so if you have a question, just raise your hand. And Suze Govers, who's right there, okay, hi Suze, we'll give you the microphone and then you can ask your question, okay? So far, as you're concerned, a word to the people abroad, the 12 listeners. If you want to ask a question, and you should be seeing this online, I hope you are, you should be seeing me in that little screen on the left. The PowerPoint presentation will follow very presently on the right. But if you want to ask a question, what you have to do is to click on the small balloon up there, where the one is marked, and then you'll see this screen, and this will allow you to ask a question online. Okay? It would be nice if you can sort of fill in at least your name so that we know who you are, and you become a sort of live presence to the rest of the students. But of course, it's not obligatory. If you want to remain anonymous, fine by me. I'll think of a name for you then. Right. And that's my privilege. So I hope this is clear, and I hope that if you have questions, really don't hesitate to ask them right in the middle. Students here are used to asking questions in the middle of a sentence. What I usually do is finish my sentence and then give you the floor. If you have a question, Suzanne, I'm not sure if she's visible to you. Suzanne Hulle will transmit your question to me. I might bounce the question back to our students or tackle it myself. We'll see how far we get. Okay? So far, as the ground rules are concerned, are there any questions from our live students here? No. Okay, great. Just another word to our 12 guests about this lecture and the course that it's a part of. Actually, this is already, I think, the 10th lecture in a series of about 12, maybe 13. So you're dropping in the middle of a course which has been going on for quite some time. Let me say something about the course first. It's a first-year course for the liberal arts students. For virtually all liberal arts students, they are able to take this course. It's an introductory course both in social sciences and psychology and in philosophy. So what we do is we acquaint students with basic concepts of the social sciences, of psychology, and also of philosophy. And the main theme that we discuss, the title of the course is Modernity, Identity, and Evil. The main theme, of course, is the question of evil and how it affects our thinking about identity and how it has changed between, let's say, pre-modernity and modernity. So basically what we're trying to find out is who we are and why we do what we're doing. Okay? That's sort of the general framework of the course. We've been discussing all kinds of sociological, psychological, and philosophical theories about identity, about the question of evil, good and evil. We've been studying a lot of case studies in which evil was committed, in which the question of identity popped up. And today is no different. It's no different in the sense that we're tackling another very spectacular historical case. It plays in the Second World War. Of course, it has to do with the Holocaust. And the text that we're using, that we're discussing today, is a text by Christopher Browning. Okay? I'll say more about that text right away. Another thing about the course, and this is something that regrettably is not really visible, is that normally it's team taught. We actually teach it with 2 lecturers. Usually I teach it together with my colleague Alkeline van Lenning from the sociology department, or the faculty of social sciences, but unfortunately she's ill today. So I hope, maybe Alkeline is watching. If you're watching, Alkeline, I hope you're doing better. But normally we teach this together so that the 2 viewpoints, the sociological, psychological, and philosophical viewpoints, can actually interact. And that was actually the design for today, that we would be doing this together. But she fell ill, so I'll have to sort of team teach on my own. Just a very Zen experience, I guess. You know the story about the one hand clapping. This is sort of one lecture team teaching. We'll see how far we get. I hope it'll come across, and I hope it won't prevent you from asking questions. All right. The question we're dealing with today is precisely the question of evil and why people commit it and how they commit it. And more pointedly, why is it that apparently very normal people who in a day-to-day situation you would never think would commit very grave atrocities, very grave evil, actually do in certain situations? That's sort of the question that we're dealing with. It's also the question that Christopher Browning, this is Mr. Browning, or Professor Browning, I should say, has tried to tackle on the basis of a historical case. He published a book called Ordinary Men that already gives you sort of the theme. How is it that ordinary men can turn into killers? That's basically the question he's asking. Let's see. The specific case he zeroed in on was a police battalion, a German police battalion that became active in Poland during the Second World War. It became active from the year 1942. Okay? And as we will see, because I'll give you the numbers, this was a group of about 500 soldiers who were basically drafted, or rather policemen actually, who actually killed thousands, literally thousands of people, especially Jews, in Poland. Okay? And I'll give you, in this lecture, it's going to be a two-tiered lecture. It has 2 volumes, basically. In the first 45 minutes, what I want to do is to present to you the facts of the case, what happened, what do we know about the perpetrators, etc., what did Browning find out. And then in the second half, what I want to do is to turn to the analysis. Okay? Because, of course, Browning himself also uses a couple of theories. He refers to a couple of theories, a few of which we already have discussed in the previous weeks. And he applies those theories in order to find an explanation for why the things that happened actually happened as they did. Okay? So it's going to be 2 parts, first the facts, then the analysis. All right? Let's go to the facts, and I'll be basically following the argument of Browning here. Browning begins by noting a very interesting fact. It's that if you go to the beginning of 1942, okay, and the war had already been going on for 2 years, if you look at the Holocaust victims, very markedly is that if you look at the total number of people that were killed, actually 80% of those people were still alive in 1942, 20% had already been killed. Okay? Now, if you turn to 1 year later, 1943, the ratio was exactly the reverse. 80% of the total number of victims had been killed, and only 20% was alive. So within 1 year, an enormous number, enormous part, the largest part of the total of the Holocaust victims has been killed. How is this possible? Okay, so many people in such a small space of time. Okay, so that's sort of the thing that puzzles Browning as a historian. How is this possible? Okay, and of course this brings us sort of to the police battalion that we're dealing with. Apparently, within that year, between 1942 and 1943, there was a sort of frenzy of killing, a very intense effort on the part of Nazi Germany to kill the Jews of Poland. Okay? And actually, it's a bit ironic, and Browning uses a term which is very familiar, of course, to people who know about Nazism. He calls it really, literally a blitzkrieg. Of course, you know that initially blitzkrieg just meant the German army progressing very speedily into occupied territory. But if you look at the speed with which the killings took place, it was also literally a blitzkrieg. It was very, very fast, an enormous number of people who were actually killed. Okay? So this is what puzzles Browning. How did this happen? How was this possible? And that's basically the central question that he tries to answer. And his sort of hunch is that apparently the Holocaust took place because apparently individuals were found ready, and perhaps even all too ready, to kill other human beings on a large scale. Okay? That's sort of the thing that we're faced with, the fact that we're faced with. And the question of Browning is, how could this happen? On a very basic level, going to the experience of the people who were actually involved in the killing. Okay? So in that sense, you can call it, it's a sort of history from below. Browning focuses not on the chain of command, on the people who were very high up in giving orders. We'll turn to that in later lectures. But really on the ground level, the people who actually did the killing, the nitty-gritty, the dirty business. Okay? That's his question. And to sort of study that question on the ground level, he turns to that reserve unit. Okay? It's a unit of the German order police. And fortunately for Browning, he found a wealth of material because, of course, after the war, this battalion and a lot of members of the battalion were brought to trial, were questioned, interrogated, etc. And extensive records of the interrogations were made. Now, of course, for a historian, this is a goldmine because I think out of the 500 members, about 125 interrogations survived, okay, which is quite a significant and representative number of records, of documents. So for Browning, this was a treasure trove to sort of study, to analyze. Okay? So there were interrogations, very often with verbatim, literal quotations from the perpetrators, very interesting. You know, when they tried to sort of explain their own behavior, justify it, sometimes even judge it, etc. So this was very, very valuable material. Okay? It was sort of a first-hand, almost a first-hand record by the people who actually were involved in the killings. Okay? And Browning was very happy, well, in a sense, as a historian, of course, very happy with this, but also quite shocked. I just give you a quote from the text. He said, "Never before I encountered the issue of choice, okay, choosing to kill or not to kill, so dramatically framed by the course of events." That's very important. We'll turn to that at the end of the lecture. The framework. So dramatically framed by the course of events and so openly discussed by the perpetrators. Okay, so that's what makes it so interesting. It's the perpetrators themselves who talk about this. Okay, who give details, who try to justify their behavior, who tell you about the facts about who told them to do what, when, and where. So this is really very valuable. Okay, it's not a sort of second or third-hand account; it's a first-hand account. Okay? And this already brings in, of course, the question. Because from these records, Browning gathered that these people were ordinary men. Okay? They were not sort of animals or sadists, etc. They were completely sort of normal, and that's what's so shocking about this. Okay? So Browning is dealing with extremely rich research material. There were about, I have to correct myself, 210 men who were actually interrogated out of the 500. So that's a very representative sample. And there were also 125 testimonies, which were very detailed, very important to reconstruct the facts, okay, how the whole business of the killing was actually organized, how it progressed, what kind of difficulties it ran into, etc. So Browning was able to reconstruct that all in a sort of to a very detailed level. Okay? And of course, from the first-hand accounts that he got from the perpetrators, he was also able to get into their minds, basically, and to sort of see how the group dynamics worked. Because, of course, that's going to be the focus of the second half of this lecture. It's about group dynamics. Okay? When people turn to killing, it has to do with all kinds of pressures that you experience because you're a member of a group, because you're not isolated. Yes? Microphone, please. Right at the front. Okay. Perhaps if you could identify yourself so that the people online actually know who you are.
I'm Giselle, and when I was reading the text, there was mention of someone, a commander or a middle-aged man who actually took a lot of pleasure in what he was doing.
Yep.
So, yeah, I don't know.
Okay, good question. Of course, I think is it the guy called Gnade? I mean, which is very ironic.
I can't remember who it was. I know he was an older member, so around the 40s, and that had something to do with the fact that he also knew a time before the Nazi propaganda, so he did also have another normative system to refer to, but that he actually enjoyed the killing.
Yeah, I think his name was Gnade, which actually means mercy in German. It's quite ironic, of course, but because there are two sort of commanders who are focused on by Browning. First one is called Trapp. That was sort of the old sentimental leader. He didn't really take pleasure in the killing, but there was another one. I think his name was Gnade. Should we return the microphone, or okay, right? Otherwise, I'll. Okay, great. But I think Browning also points out that if you had encountered this man on the street before the war and had talked to him and had sort of interacted with him, you would never have suspected that he would turn into someone who completely liked killing. So apparently what Browning tries to find out is how this group dynamic, once you're in the situation, apparently brings out certain traits in people that you would never expect in peacetime. Okay? So I think that's precise. They were not sort of born sadists. Apparently they turned into sadists, people taking, some of them taking pleasure in the killing as a result of the situation. I think that's sort of what Browning tries to show you. It's not sort of an inborn tendency, or if it's an inborn tendency, it can only be brought out by a very sort of specific situation. Okay? But it doesn't mean that this guy would in any situation have turned into a sadist. Okay? I think that's sort of the point he's trying to make. Does that sort of answer your question? Yeah, but of course, I think when Browning zeroes in on this character, it's also to show that this was quite an exception, that most of the people did the killing because out of a sense of duty, not because they actually took pleasure in it. I think so. I mean, at least that's how I sort of read Browning. It's that he zeroes in on this guy because he was a bit of the exception. He actually really liked doing what he did. Also because he was a drunk. I think he was also an alcoholic, etc. So, yeah. I don't know, we'll have to look at, maybe we should look at the text. I'll try to look at it during the break. Okay. But to go back to the research material, because it's, I also wanted to make a couple of sort of more scientific points about how Browning actually goes about as a historian. There is a difference, of course, if you look back at the previous material that we discussed, the material by Lerner, for example, but also the material of Dalrymple, you see that this, once again, is a different approach. Lerner, of course, takes a very descriptive and a very sort of quantitative approach by doing experiments, etc., about the just world theory. So it's a very descriptive and quantitative, quantified approach. If you look at Dalrymple, it's much more normative, he's much more judgmental, and it's more anecdotal. Okay, he just takes a couple of cases from which he then sort of extrapolates. If you look at what Browning does, it's yet another way of approaching the thing. He has this whole wealth of material, of interrogation material, of testimonies by people, and he tries to analyze that. Okay, so it's more than anecdote for the case of Dalrymple, but of course it's less than the experiment of Lerner, for example. He doesn't do experiments, or he does a sort of virtual experiment by analyzing all this historical material. Okay, but once again, he is engaged in a kind of historical sociology. Okay, trying to sort of find out what kind of social pressures, what kind of social processes actually led to people doing the killing. Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay. So note the difference with Lerner on the one hand and Dalrymple on the other hand. All right. Of course, Browning also notes that there are a couple of difficulties in using this material, and I think most of it will be familiar if you've ever taken a history course or something like that. Of course, testimonies and witness accounts, they're always very problematic. Okay, so let me just give a couple of examples. The interrogations were made 20 years after the events, so that's quite a long stretch of time. So a couple of problems emerge. Memory distortion. Okay, human memory doesn't function like a sort of movie camera. It doesn't register literally, or does, at least the interpretation of it doesn't proceed literally. Memories can become distorted. You know, all of you have heard about false memories, for example. So that's one of the big problems. Of course, very likely, a couple of the people were actually lying in their interrogations, okay, minimizing their own role, for example, or denying that certain things had happened. Okay, so that's one thing you have to take into account. It means that you have to compare several accounts and sort of use the one to sort of criticize the other, etc. False claims, of course, once again with the same sort of purpose, to diminish your own role or to blame other people, etc. Another more sort of structural problem is that you have different perspectives. Okay? If you have 100 or 210 interrogations, you have 210 perspectives on the same situation. Okay? And you all know, if you read historical accounts, different historical accounts of one event, how different they can be. Okay, so once again, it's a question of comparing and being very critical about that. Okay. Another thing you should never... Yes, we have a question, I think. All right. Suzanne.
Yes, we have a question by Ernest Mason. And
Welcome,
he
Ernest. Ernest, that's right?
Yes,
Okay.
Ernest. And his question is whether... was this a case of betrayal by moralists or Christians whom also were dominant in Germany and elsewhere?
Okay, could you repeat the first part of the question, Suzanne?
Was this a case of betrayal by moralists or Christians whom also were dominant in Germany and elsewhere?
Betrayal by moralists. Could you sort of specify what you mean with betrayal by moralists, Ernest?
Yes, I'll wait for him to reply.
All right, great. Because the second part is clear. I mean, the Christian part, but the first one is unclear to me.
Let's take a break.
Sorry?
Coffee, anyone?
Okay, try to keep it down. Remember, we have the noise problem. Nothing yet? Okay, maybe in the meantime, the second part was about the... could you repeat the second part, Suzanne? Just to make sure that I got it right.
The second part of Ernest's question was, or Christians whom also were dominant in Germany and elsewhere.
Okay, if I'm correct, I think at least a part of the perpetrators were Christians, were raised in a Christian culture. And correct me if I'm wrong. You've already also read the text. All right. This is team teaching. We're doing it together. Okay. That could be a good definition.
Well, yeah, kind of as a reaction to the question, I think it's quite hard to claim that it's the Christian mentality or something like that that in Germany influenced the anti-Semitism. So, in the light of the question, I would say the first part. What he meant was just normal people who kind of had morals and threw them away. So I think that's more the case in Ernest's question than Christian people being angry at Jews for some reason.
Oh, sure. Okay. We'll tackle another question, but I guess Ernest has already added something. Well, let's go. Let's first turn to you then.
Yeah, in the text of Browning, he actually tackles that problem of Christianity. And he mentions that Christianity was the enemy of the propaganda of the Nazis because in Christianity it's problematic to kill someone.
Sure.
And like you also see that in The Merchant of Venice, that there is that conflict, but that other interpretations of Christianity, because it's such a broad thing, you could interpret them as, Jewish people as the killers of Christ.
Exactly.
So the propaganda just used one part of Christianity, but Browning specifically states that Christianity was the enemy of Nazism, and so was communism. So
sure, of course. I mean, you could say, on an abstract level, it was the enemy of Nazism. But if you look at, of course, historical facts, the Christian Church did collaborate quite actively with the Nazi regime. Yes, absolutely, sure. There's this whole scandal about Pope. I just forget his title or his name and his number, but he never sort of.
16.
Sorry.
Benedict XVI.
Was it Benedict XVI?
The one that's right now?
No, not right. The Pope who was actually Pope during the Second World War never actually pronounced himself against Nazism in the name of Christianity. That was quite striking. So, and there was actually actual collaboration between the two. Although you're absolutely right, and on the ground level there was an antagonism, or there should have been one, between Christianity and Nazism. And some Christians actually did oppose Nazism out of their Christian persuasion, but not all of them. Precisely the idea of the Jews as the killers of Christ was a very pervasive notion. All right. We don't have a microphone, but let me just first turn to Suzanne, because Ernest has apparently added something to his question.
Yes, what Ernest added was, he means if those who perpetrate their crime were given blessings by religious leaders. That's his question.
Right. I don't think so, no. That doesn't really materialize from Browning's book, that they were actually sort of given a green light from religious authorities. I don't think so. At least not from what I read in Browning. I think some of them might have been Christians just by socialization, because they grew up in a Christian background. But Browning does make the point that this apparently didn't really play a very big role in their actions. Okay, I hope that's a sort of answer to you, Ernest. Let's go back to first Alberto and then Giselle. Alberto, okay.
I actually have a different answer than you because
okay, good.
I took 4-period history in school, and one of the things that really struck me was that in the Second World War, it was actually quite common for the Nazi regime to put humongous pressure on church communities and especially on the priests and the preachermen in a way to actually have people convinced of Nazism in a way, but still the church, of course, there wasn't a direct link between Nazism and Christianity, but the church actively kind of promoted it amongst its members.
Yeah.
So, and that was under pressure from the Nazi regime. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Alberto. Move on the microphone.
Okay, I just have 2 points. And the first one is more a theological one. So I actually am pretty much against the institution of the church, but the church is obliged to forgive and to provide sanctuary to those, even those who are criminals. Like in Belgium, the Van Geluwe, he was allowed to stay in the Abbey of West Vleteren.
Yep.
And they had to provide him sanctuary. So on that part of why the Catholic Church or why Christians would bless killers, it's because they don't do the moral judgment. They leave that to God or some kind of thing.
Right, that's one possible argument, yeah.
But I just wanted to ask a question about the Aristotelian values or something, but I kind of forgot it now. So
what would Aristotle say about this, or is it sort of?
No, it had. Yeah, I can't remember right now.
All right, we'll come back to it maybe after the break if the question comes back. I just had a question to Ernest. Did we sort of answer your question or give you something to think about? I'll give you some time to reply. It always takes a while. If there are no further questions, let's go back to the methodological problems. So, of course, the problems that I discussed up till now are the problems on the part of those people who are being interrogated. Different perspectives, people are lying, making false claims. But of course, the problem is not only on that side, the problem is also on the position of the interrogators. The presence of an interrogator can already shape the kinds of answers that you get, because the questions will, to a large extent, determine what kind of answers you get. Now, a good interrogator, a good scientist, or a good interrogator in general will know this and will, of course, make sure that he asks a lot of questions and different questions. So to prevent that, he just asks one single set or type of questions to which you get only one type of answers. But there's always the problem that the presence of an interrogator and the presence of certain questions do, to a certain extent, determine what kind of answers you're going to get. And of course, apparently, the people who were being interrogated, this happened in different situations, Maybe at home, or at their homes, or maybe at a police station, I don't know, in different situations. And of course, that situation can also affect the kinds of answers that you're going to get. Maybe someone who's being interviewed at home, like Roger van Geluwe perhaps, well, not really his home, but his exile, will make people more comfortable, more prone to talk. Whereas if they're in a more alien environment, they'll be less prone to talk. So this also influences the kinds of answers that you get. Those are the methodological points. Let me turn to a couple of just facts. I think Browning discusses sort of two major events. The first one at Jozefow in Poland. Where basically the deportation of the Jews to the gas chambers, to concentration camps, proved to be impossible. And the only solution between very large sort of quotation marks, proved to be to execute them on the spot. And these were a couple of thousands, so it was a very large population. So the police battalion actually was dispatched, Police Battalion 101 was actually dispatched to Jozefow on the quick. They were dispatched very rapidly, as a sort of test to see whether they could be relied on to actually finish the job. So they were actually sent off quite quickly without much preparation. And this is a factor that is very important for Browning, because he stresses one time and again that there was no long process of indoctrination and preparation. They were just sent off and given the job to kill all these people. So it was kind of a test. It was a population of 1,800 Jews who lived in this village. The leader, Major Trapp, he comes very much alive, I think, in Browning's account. He was the leader of the group. He was a member of the old guard, so he was not really. He had been a sort of conservative reactionary before the rise of Nazism. He had become a member of the Nazi Party, but hadn't really made a very big career. Also, apparently he was very sentimental. He was not really sort of, the kind of very iron sort of hearted guy. Apparently he was very sympathetic to his men, etc. So a very sort of human character, you could say. But he was given a very short notice. He was told, assemble your men and you're sent off to Jozefow with this job. Okay? Actually, the orders that were given were very deceptive. Trapp and, of course, via Trapp, his men, were given to understand that they had to go on guard duty, that you just had to perform guard duty in Jozefow. They were not told that they were about to go on a killing spree. Okay, so you see that there was a solid degree of deception in the orders that they were given. Okay, so this was sort of the conditions. When they arrived, of course, at Jozefow, they were told it's not a guard duty. You'll have to execute the whole village. Okay, all 1,800 Jews have to be executed. Okay, now of course, then of course comes a very striking sort of find for Browning. Is that we had 500 soldiers, and you would his expectation apparently is that when they were told, okay, it's not guard duty, it's killing, it's executions, a lot would say, no, that's not my job, that's not what I was given to understand, that would be my job. So he expected a lot would have actually refused to do the killing. Apparently, only 12 actually refused, for various reasons, for sort of different reasons, sort of incapacity, etc. But only 12 out of 500. Okay, so the vast majority of them just went about their jobs. Okay, apparently they didn't sort of take the deception as something very problematic. They just said, okay, well, we're here, we'll do this. Okay, so only 12 out of the 500 actually refused to do the killing. All right. Of course, Browning's question is why? Why was this group of refusers so very small? Okay. We'll come back to that after the break, but of course Browning already tries to give a couple of explanations. One thing, of course, was the speed. Of course, it was no accident that the authorities had dispatched the battalion so fast, because of course if you're dispatched so fast and then given a completely different task, you don't have the time to think. There was no time for reflection. That's a first argument. Okay, the pressure was put on them to be very speedily. They had to make a very swift decision. Once they were there, they were given no time, actually, to think about what they were about to do, so a lack of time for reflection. The second one, of course, was a pressure for conformity, and that's going to be a major part in the second part of the lecture. Of course, it's also called peer group pressure. There were all kinds of internal pressures in the groups to sort of collaborate. Okay, they were there. They had given, of course, had been misled, but suddenly they were given a task, and apparently some kind of group dynamic. Think of the social norm that we encountered in previous lectures. Apparently a sort of social norm emerged from which it was very, very hard to deviate. Okay, and that social norm was, it's a dirty job, but we're going to have to do it. Okay, that's going to be our task. And deviation, apparently, sort of implicitly, deviation was very difficult. Okay. Okay, so a strong urge not to step out of the group. And maybe one other factor, according to Browning, was that the battalion had been assembled very recently. So the members didn't really know each other very well. Okay? Of course, if you don't know each other very well, you're in alien surroundings, you're very insecure, you're uncertain, you don't know how others will react. So that makes you all the more prone to sort of conform to whatever norm is going to be imposed on you. Okay? Apparently Browning thinks that, I'll be right there, Suzanne. Apparently Browning thinks that if the members had been together longer and had known each other longer, perhaps there would have been more resistance against the new task. Okay, we have another question.
This question is from Patricia.
Patricia,
and her
welcome.
question is, Browning offers as a cause of the mass killing of Jews the fact that people were ready to kill. They have accumulated the fear, aggressiveness and violence throughout the time. What is exactly the source of this accumulation, and can it be considered as a cause for different or other violences and wars?
Wow, those are very, very big questions. Well, thanks a lot, Patricia. Very good questions. I think I'll just bounce them back because it seems to work quite fine. Do we need to repeat the question? Maybe could you just repeat the question just to sort of let it sink in, Suzanne? Oh yeah, we need the microphone again, sorry.
Yes, so here's Patricia's question again. Browning offers as a cause of the massive killing of Jews the fact that people were ready to kill. They have accumulated the fear, aggressiveness, and violence throughout the time. What is exactly the source of this accumulation, and can it be considered as a cause for different other violences and wars?
Okay, thank you. Jill, please. Right. Can we have a microphone up front? All right. And if other people want to intervene, please just raise your hand and we'll give you the microphone.
Yeah, for the assignment we had to do, so when we had to look at what happened in Bosnia, and you see that it's really, people were afraid. And it was really this tension that was the source of aggression. And so people were afraid of each other. And
Right.
that just stimulated everything more. So I think the answer to her question is ultimately just the fear of your own life, and also the fear of, like, what Browning called careerism, sort of in a way, fear of your materialistic well-being and such, but just generally fear that pushes people to become aggressive and pushes people to do those things.
Right, but let me just sort of, just for reasons of clarity, I mean, you could say that this mutual fear, the question was really about the readiness to kill. They were ready to kill. You could say that this mutual fear just emerged once they were there, and it didn't really take much preparation or sort of becoming ready for this. I mean, how would you sort of relate that to the question whether they had been sort of made ready to kill?
Well, we were talking about 1942, and yeah, Hitler Germany had been going on for since when, like 19 whatever. So people had been living in a sphere of war much, much longer. Just like the people in Bosnia, you saw them that they were living in a way that they were living, they could hear bombshells, they were afraid, and systematically small things started filtering through. So these people, even though they didn't know each other or all these reasons that you've listed, they were probably also living in fear, and they knew that they were going on a mission to guard, but even that, I could imagine as a soldier, you're still afraid you could die. And so it's like pushing a wild animal into a corner. The only reaction you're going to get is it's going to attack you out of fear.
Okay, good. Okay, thanks. I think there was another question.
Yeah, the same thing. You cannot say it just emerged that day. It's Nazi Germany for the years before.
Okay, so there was a long sort of process of preparation. Okay, good. I think we have another question right at the back. If you could identify yourself for the people, and especially for Patricia.
Patricia, hi Patricia.
Good.
But I think it's also very much about a we against them feeling, because also what we've seen in the documentary about Bosnia, that as long as the war is far away, it doesn't bother you and you can go along with everybody. But when it comes near you, you start scapegoating and you start saying, okay, it's them and this is us.
Sure.
So that's also very big part of forming this aggression against Jews, I think.
Right. A good point. I mean, of course, I mean, they were dealing with Jews, and of course there had been this whole process of indoctrination, although Browning has sort of questions about that. But of course they were led to see the whole Jewish population as outside the bounds of humanity. Okay, they were really the enemy to be destroyed. So that also played a major role in their being ready to kill. Okay. Let's just take another question from the students and go back to you, Suzanne. Okay?
Yeah, I've just a problem to relate it to the village in Bosnia, because the people knew each other. It's not that
That's right. That's the
they
difference.
came in and there were 1,800 Jews. They knew the people they killed. They had been living for them their whole lives. So I think there's a huge difference.
That is a huge difference, absolutely. But what you do see is that once the dynamic of we against them does kick in, apparently killing becomes easy in a certain way. But you're right, the build-up to that was different, and the conditions were totally different.
The only
absolutely.
argument for this, I don't know how many foreign soldiers came into the city, because if there are many soldiers coming into the city, it can also create this new relation. But
we don't know that. Sure.
Depends.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's return the microphone to Suzanne. All right. I hope this sort of It's helpful, Patricia. Did we get a reaction from Patricia? Okay.
Yes, Patricia did indeed reply to what Giselle had to say, and she agrees with Giselle and says, well, especially after their experience of World War I. So that was her comment on that.
Mm-hmm. That too, of course, the whole question of humiliation, etc., played a major role. Absolutely, I think that's a good point to stress also. Okay, well, thank you, Patricia. Thanks for the questions. If there are any others wanting to intervene, please do so. Let's just see how far we're doing. We're almost near the end of the first half. Let's see if I probably will have to skip a couple of things. Let me just see what I can. Actually, a lot of this has already been covered. I had a list of sort of the division between the refusers, the people who actually. There were a couple of people who stopped halfway because, I mean, the killing really went on for days. It was also physically a very sort of exhausting experience. But the interesting thing that Browning notes is that in retrospect, the people who refused are not really proud of themselves. You know, they just say, I thought for myself, I was critical, I didn't go with the flow. No, most of them, or if not all of them, said, no, I was a coward. So even they felt sort of the sense that they actually abandoned their comrades to a very dirty task and that they were actually cowardly, that they didn't live up to their task. So you see how strong this force of group dynamics is, that even the people who refused, for whatever reason, still think of themselves as deficient. Okay, that's very striking. You see how strong this social norm can become. Okay, the people, and even the people who did perpetrate, the 400, in retrospect, sort of developed all kinds of mechanisms to sort of block it out and to blot it out. Amnesia, making false claims, sort of distorting the reality, etc. 50 of them just stopped halfway because they just got sick, because it really, literally, their body sort of refused to cooperate in killing. And as Browning sort of points out, this was actually perhaps the best way to sort of opt out, because it sort of confirmed the idea that killing was actually sort of a very macho business, something for real men. Okay, so it was actually convenient because you could say, well, I'm too weak, I can't stand it, I'm just going off. But it really confirmed once again this idea that it was a very tough job to be done, and not for sissies, basically. That's sort of the idea. But what is very striking is that none of them actually voiced ethical or political protests. No one said sort of, I can't do this for moral reasons. I can't kill my fellow man. Okay, which perhaps brings us back to the Christian question. If there had been any Christians, apparently none said this is a violation of the basic Christian ethos, okay, and basic Christian ethics. All right. This is something that we actually already discussed. The Jews were really seen as the outsiders, okay? As a result of Nazi propaganda, among other things, the Jews were really, it was really sort of seen, there was no common ground between, let's say, Germans and humans in general and the Jews. They were really beyond the pale, okay? They were less than humans, actually, okay? Less than animals, even. I don't know, there's this very famous anecdote that at some, I'm not sure if it was Dachau or Auschwitz, at some concentration camp, the dogs, the German shepherds, the dogs of the guards, of the authorities of the prison, of the concentration camp were actually called humans, Mensch. Okay, and there was a dog cage at the entrance, and in that dog cage was not a dog. Okay, I'll leave it to your imagination who was in it. But it was clear that from the Nazi ideology, being a Jew was being less than an animal. Okay, so they were removed very far from any sort of community, any common ground with the Germans. Okay, so that was a very important part. Let's see. Actually, I'm just leafing through. Let me just give you the numbers, and I think I'll stop there for the moment, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of what happened. Okay, this was the number of killings by the battalion through the years. You can see the month and the year, starting from July 42 up till November 43. Okay, and you also note the rise. Okay, they were becoming more and more efficient. Okay, as they sort of overcame their revulsion, as they began to sort of acquire a certain skill in these mass execution. But if you look at the end, 16,500 executions. Just try to imagine what kind of slaughter this was. It's horrifying. It's appalling, and it's almost impossible to conceive of this. Okay, so in a total, this was 500 men who in a span of a little more than a year, actually manually, okay, this was not by gas chamber, this was by shooting, actually killed 38,000 people. All right, so once again, Browning sort of asked, how was this possible? Okay, once again, we're dealing with ordinary men, and this maybe, I'll just stop at this point. Of course, there is the idea that they were, in a sense, ready to kill, but in another sense, Browning also tries to show that whatever sort of factors that you try to identify and whatever sort of temptation we might have to sort of look to isolate single factors as leading to the readiness, he also minimizes them or tries to put them in perspective. Okay, it's not just the Nazi ideology. It's not just the upbringing of the Germans. It's also the fact that they were brought in this situation, whereas they were totally normal men. They were not extremists. Trapp was not really a careerist. He never made it very far. Most of the members were not sort of extremists, raging Nazis or raging anti-Semites. But when they came there, they turned into very efficient killers. Okay, one final question. All right, please give us your name and then...
Hello, I'm Anke. I have a question. Nowadays, it's known that a lot of soldiers who come back from the battlefield, they have problems. They have psychological problems. Is there anything known about these people, or maybe someone who killed himself, committed suicide, or has had problems? Is there anything known, or they just lived on and?
Good question. I don't know if Browning says much about that. I think one of the things I do remember is that he said that a lot of them were still living their lives after the war. Maybe some of them had been punished, but they were just living on. Whether there were any sort of PTSD cases, etc., I don't think so, although I'm not sure. And I think, of course, there's a difference in the sense that this was not a sort of ordinary war situation. In the sense that they themselves were not under attack. I mean, if there was any sort of psychological stress, it was from their own activity, not from being shelled or sniped at by an enemy. So that might make a difference. Although I can imagine that for some, perhaps the people who actually had to give up because they couldn't stand it no longer, all this carnage, that they might have developed psychological problems in the long term. But I think Browning says very little about that. Okay, so in that sense, maybe they remain very ordinary. Yeah. Okay, good. Suzanne, I don't know what the protocol is. Do we take a break as usual? Okay, then I would say to the people online, stay tuned. We'll be back in about 10 to 15 minutes. I think we'll reassemble by 11:45, local time, that is. Okay, thanks for all the questions. All right. Okay, the first part of my announcement was for local consumption. The second part is that I was thanking the technical staff for the support, so thank you very much. In the meantime, I learned that actually Ernest, one of our online participants, I'm not sure if you're still there, Ernest, I do hope you are, actually asked another question which came along during the lecture, is whether for Hitler actually the view of the Jews as the killers of Christ did play a role. I'm not sure if it played a real role for Hitler personally, because Hitler sort of styled himself as an atheist, but it did play a role in certain Catholic and Christian circles. Okay, this sort of ingrained idea of the Jews as the killers of Christ did, arguably play a role in the rise of anti-Semitism in not only in Germany but also in other Christian and Catholic countries. So that's the basic sort of established fact. Okay. I've skipped a couple of things. What I won't discuss is another event which was also recorded, in which a different leader was actually active, was much more of the sadist type, or the guy who actually took pleasure in the killing. But what you also see, and what is the focus for Browning, is that by that time the battalion had become much more sort of routined and much more skilled in doing the killing. Okay, which shows you why the numbers really increased quite rapidly near the end of their tour. Okay, so that's another thing that he points out. I now want to turn to the second part, which is much more sort of the part of analysis. Okay, we've seen the facts. You've already given a couple of pointers at possible explanations, but now I really want to focus on the more theoretical part and go into the explanations that Browning tries to give. Okay. He tries to sort of show that basically this idea of group pressure was a very important factor in the fact that so few people refused and a large majority actually participated in the killing without much sort of putting up much resistance, or if any. Okay? Apparently, being a nonconformist, saying, no, I'm not going to participate, and that doesn't make me a coward, was really beyond the reach of the majority of the people. Okay? That's the first sort of finding that Browning does. Okay? It was beyond the majority. And I wanted to sort of reconnect this with something we saw earlier in the course. I was thinking of the smoke experiment. You remember this little film that we saw? You see how difficult it is to be nonconformist. If everybody just remains seated, all the actors remain seated, it's very hard to break through that and just go away and bring yourself into safety. I think it was only one guy, the artist, who sort of maybe is a sort of professional nonconformist, actually sort of had the courage, basically, and the independence of mind to say, this is crazy, I'm going. Okay? But you see that a large majority just cannot sort of muster this kind of independence. Okay? And this is just a basic fact. Okay? It's not a judgment that, it's not saying that means the majority of people are evil. It just shows that a majority of people are very hard to sort of have a difficult time in sort of moving themselves beyond the situation and becoming independent of the situation. Okay? So it's not a nice sort of finding, but it is a basic finding. Okay? Another thing, and this is something that came up already during the break also, is that apparently some very perverted form of morality and ethos emerges in this process of killing, in the sense that this killing is presented as a duty, perhaps even a moral duty, as an obligation. And by that token, every member of that battalion sees it as an own duty to contribute. Okay? It's almost like there's a sort of immanent or intrinsic standard of justice which emerges there, in the sense that there's a burden and the burden has to be shared equally. Okay? So it's almost a distributive justice that emerges there. And those people who refuse actually blame themselves for not taking their share of the burden. Okay? That's a second point. So even in these atrocious, extreme circumstances, there is a sort of standard of justice that operates. Very weird. Okay? It's a dirty business, but it has to be shared equally. Everybody has to put in his or her effort. In this case, it was only his. But it's really striking that people tend to continue to reason in terms of justice here. Not only retrospectively, but apparently also while they were doing it. Okay? Because those people who opted out because of physical revulsion also sensed that they were actually not being very just, in the sense that they did not contribute to the group effort. Okay, so that's quite striking as well. And the third point, of course, is the whole idea of what Browning calls self-negotiation, is that people try to sort of negotiate with themselves as to how far they will go. I think Browning notes a couple of these perpetrators who said, well, I'll kill these people, but I'm not going to kill mothers and children. I'll leave that to the others. I can't do that. That would be evil. Okay? So you see you're sort of operating with internal distinctions there between what is acceptable, an acceptable evil, and what is not. And this is a process of self-negotiation. You're trying to save your own face there. Okay? We have a question. Right. Okay. Yes?
Is that then the same as what Dalrymple says, the separation between the normative and the phenomenal self?
Yeah. I think so, yes, absolutely. It's the idea of sort of trying to sort of calibrate what you should be doing with what you're actually doing and bringing the two close together, okay? And actually taking what you're actually doing as a norm for what you should be doing, okay? So it's a sort of process of rationalization, which you also see on a much less dramatic scale in the anecdotes that Dalrymple relates, for example. Sure, that's a very good point. Okay, we're always doing that. And the striking thing is that even in extreme situations like these, we're still doing that. And trying to negotiate with ourselves as to what is acceptable given the circumstances. Okay? So that's the second point. Third point, self-negotiation. Okay? Browning also sort of tries to find out about the leadership. One of the possible explanations is that the leaders were very carefully selected. They were actually sort of hardwired Nazis who were trained to sort of do this kind of atrociousness, etc. But Browning finds that this was not really the case. Okay, there should be a question mark, of course. Were they carefully selected? And if you look at the people, people like Trapp and Gnade, etc., they were not sort of standard SS men. They sort of were in between. They sort of fell in between the cracks. They were not real careerists. Trapp had never been sort of accepted within the SS, although he had been an old guard, and there was a lot of respect in the SS and in the Nazi Party for the old guard. But he never really made it. So he was a sort of in-between character. Okay, so that explanation, there were hardwired SS Nazis, doesn't suffice. Okay. And you see that Browning sort of works through all kinds of possible sort of standard intuitive explanations, and one by one he says, no, this was not the case. Everything that would make these men extraordinary, it doesn't work. They were just ordinary, and that's the scary thing. Okay? Any attempt to make them extraordinary will fail, because if you look at the facts, they were not extraordinary. There was nothing in them that sort of made them give them a special disposition to this kind of killing. That's the scary thing. Trapp was a weakling, he was a reactionary, a traditionalist, a nostalgic type, etc. The other people like Gnade, Hoffmann, Wohlauf, they were not sort of model SS men, sort of the ruthless killers, etc. No, they were all more or less sort of failures, basically. They never really made a very big career. Okay, so you can't sort of put the blame there, or give that as a sort of sole explanation. Okay. Browning, of course, those are a couple of possible sort of ways of explaining that are moderately successful. Browning also addresses a very important attempt that was made at explaining the behavior of these people, actually by someone who was both a philosopher and a psychologist and a sociologist, Theodor Adorno. You probably meet him time and again. Adorno is a very influential philosopher of the 20th century. Adorno actually developed a psychological theory, an attempt to psychologically explain the behavior of people like the members of the battalion, by arguing that among the human types, and you can think a little bit, in the sense of Plato, the tyrannical type, etc. He also has a sort of typology. There is a special type which he calls the authoritarian personality. Okay, it's a very famous theory. The authoritarian personality, it's a couple of traits that certain people have which make them predisposed to become fascists or to become totalitarians. Okay? And he calls that the authoritarian personality. And he made up a sort of checklist of certain character traits that you have or need to have in order to develop this authoritarian personality and then to start collaborating with authoritarian regimes. Okay? So his claim was basically not everyone is predisposed to this kind of lapse, to this kind of behavior. It's a certain type, a certain authoritarian type that has a predisposition. Okay? And he developed what he called the F scale. I'm not sure what the F stands for. It could be fascist. I'm not sure, probably. But it's a sort of scale with a couple of parameters. And the higher you score, the more, the stronger you have indications that you are or have an authoritarian personality. Okay, it's an F scale. These are just a couple of the traditional sort of traits that you need to have. A rigid adherence to values. Okay, so you're a Prinzipienreiter, as they call it in German. Always sticking to values. No matter what the situation is, you're always sort of stand up for your values. Sort of rigidity. Also a submissiveness to authority. You're easy to bow to whatever authority sort of presents itself. Very important, and we've already encountered this. There is a sort of aggressiveness to an other group, a group identified as the other. Okay, Jews or Gypsies or in this case Muslims, for example. It just depends on what kind of group you're going to identify. But there's a sort of aggression or aggressiveness towards this outgroup. Okay, you identify yourself by sort of saying what you're not. Okay, you're not that group. Okay, you're different. Okay. Also, a reluctance or even an opposition to reflection, to thinking, to independence, to intellectual independence, saying this is all highbrow stuff, I don't want to do anything, this is intellectualist, etc. Some say, no, this is a leftist hobby. That's another way of sort of criticizing this. But this is something that you encounter. Okay, there's an opposition to introspection. Okay, the idea is if you're inside your head too much, you're too reflective. That's a bad thing. It's not healthy to think too much, to be too critical. Okay, this is also a character trait of the authoritarian personality. Superstition. Okay, Okay, the belief in the idea that certain invisible powers are at work. You know, they are doing this to us, the government or them or whatever, the FBI. Sort of, you know, it ties in with what I think Alkeline explained about the paranoid personality last week. Okay, so there's a lot of paranoia, stereotyping. You know, sort of dividing up society in different types, fixed types, which are very difficult to change and which never change. You know, think of the talk in Nazi Germany about the eternal Jew. You know, Jews will never change; they'll all be the same. They'll be deceptive, etc., etc. So this is sort of the things that you find back. Also, a preoccupation with toughness. Okay, the idea that, you know, if something bad happens, we should react swiftly and toughly, sort of to set an example, etc. Is still around, of course, with power, also with destructiveness. You know, if something bad happens, it should be utterly destroyed, eradicated. You know, sort of this very radical talk that you have, tough boy talk, and also the disposition to project. Okay, if something happens, you project it to a certain agent, etc., who's responsible for all the evils. In the background, of course, there's a little bit of learner here, of course, okay, because all this is the idea that you are living in a just world, okay, and these are the rules of the just world. If you don't conform, well, you know, shape up or ship out, something like that. Okay. But the main point, and of course, Browning refers to this because it's a classic account of the authoritarian personality, a classic attempt to explain this behavior, but he's very critical of it. And he refers to the critique, a very famous critique on Adorno by Zygmunt Bauman. It says it falls apart. If you really study how people really behave, if you really study the psyche of these perpetrators, the theory of Adorno is not really worth very much. It just falls apart. It's very hard to really argue and show and demonstrate that that these people were actually authoritarian personalities. Actually, the truth is far more sort of distressing. These people were absolutely completely normal. We have a question from somewhere in the world. Suzanne.
Does checking if the microphone works?
I hope it does.
Yes, it should. It's another question from Patricia.
Okay, good to see you here, Patricia. You're still here? Thank you.
Is it possible that the lack of success or lack of extraordinary abilities was actually the key to the selection of the main representatives of the Nazi party? Because these people tried to surpass themselves and the Nazi period was the perfect opportunity to do that?
Good question. Okay, I'm just going to bounce it to our students to see what happens. Who wants to react? Should we repeat the question? Could you just repeat the question, Suzanne, just to make sure that we
Yes, here it is again.
Yep.
Is it possible that the lack of success or lack of extraordinary abilities was actually the key to the selection of the main representatives for the Nazi party? Because these people tried to surpass themselves and the Nazi period was the perfect opportunity to do that.
Right. Albert, we have someone who tries to answer the question. Albert, the floor is yours.
I have to say, I think it's a very interesting theory because we've been looking at this whole macro thing, you know, the group pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But in a way, now that I hear this come up,
right.
it is, of course, true that these leaders had something to prove because they never had a chance to or never did.
Mm-hmm.
Though I don't believe that the Nazi regime would have really selected them on the basis of that. They were
Mm-hmm.
quite fond of selecting, you know, the most vicious killers for the most vicious killings in a way.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that it must have definitely had a gigantic influence in the outcome of the situation.
So tapping into the ambition and the frustrations of the leaders, right? Okay, we'll move the microphone to. Oh, we have 3 more people. Great. Okay.
Yeah, I disagree with you because I think that, first of all, this was 1942, and by then what the world must have looked like was pretty bad. So people were, you know, malnutrition, a whole lot of things. And that if you read Browning, he specifically also says that these people, they were normal people and they didn't have the intention to build out a career in the police or whatever afterwards. So they were selected randomly almost.
Yeah.
And they thought, okay, we're just going to go on guard duty, just do my duty and come back home and just live my normal little life. And they didn't have this careerism. So the fact that they were ordinary I don't think it stimulated like the feeling for careerism because it wasn't present a priori anyway.
Yeah.
So
It also seems to me that Browning is trying to bust that myth that there were, so the people who were put in charge were really, raring to go, killing, etc. They were not. That's the most distressing thing about the whole situation. Let's move the microphone to the back. You have, I think, 2 more people. Yes. 1 more people. Yes. Okay, could you identify yourself to Patricia so that she knows who you are?
Yes, well, I'm Tim. I just wanted to say that I think that the question, or the way I understood the question, was that it was a bit more aimed at the higher up Nazis and not really this police squad. So, but I think that the same applies for both. That every revolution brings opportunities for, well, basically new ambitious people. You see it when Napoleon comes and the meritocracy is introduced. He said, well, this was the son of a fisherman, for example, and now he's a general. So in every revolution, with every change of regime, there's always a change of regime, exactly that. So I don't think that basically the lack of skill was a prerequisite for being selected in the Nazi regime. It was just people with different opinions and who now had the opportunity to realize them.
Right. Okay, thank you. Okay, I hope this is helpful, Patricia. Let's see if there are any other reactions. Right. Any reaction from Patricia, Suzanne, or...
No, I didn't get another reaction from Patricia. I did get a reaction from Alkeline from Lenning, though.
Oh, hi Alkeline, good to see you.
First of all, she's really sick at home, and she's giving her compliments to you and to all of the students.
Thank you.
And she explained the F scale that was on the slide.
Okay, good. Well, see, now it's becoming team teaching again. Thank you, Alkeline.
So here's the addition from Alkeline from Lenning. She's explaining that the F scale is an instrument that tries to estimate of fascist receptivity at the personality level.
Okay,
I
right.
don't know if that helps, but...
It does? Sure. Okay, so the F does stand for fascist, apparently,
Yes.
then. Okay, well, that's good to know. So thank you, Alkeline. Feel free to sort of intervene whenever it's necessary. Okay. All right, let's just move on. I was sort of discussing the reactions to Adorno. Okay, it proved to be a very influential theory, but there was some criticism on it. Precisely, Baumann actually argued that, see, it doesn't really require a specific authoritarian personality to be able to commit these atrocities. What Browning type, of course, agrees with that. He says, precisely what I find in my research is that these people were chillingly normal. There was nothing exceptional, authoritarian, proto-fascist or even fascist about them. They were just basically ordinary citizens like you and me. And that's precisely what is so hard to swallow, of course, because, and this is also, we are all sort of learnarians in that sense. We like to sort of distance ourselves from these people. Why? Because precisely we don't really want to harbor the thoughts that perhaps they're very much like us and that we are just as capable of becoming killers in similar situations as they were. Okay, we have another question. Yes.
How then can you explain the 12 people that did say no? Because if every normal people can commit fascist atrocity, that would say that everybody's the same and everybody has the same chance on committing these crazy acts. But how then do you explain those people who did say no? And how do you explain, like with Zimbardo, the woman that said this is not going anywhere, etc., etc., etc.?
Sure. Well, I was talking in terms of averages, of course. I'm not going to say everyone. What I was saying is that, in general, on average, any one of us could become it. Okay, but of course, similar. I guess in similar situations, some of us might precisely become refuseniks and say, no, I'm not going to participate. But what I do want to point out again is that those people who refused didn't think of themselves as, I'm doing the right thing. They were actually seeing themselves as cowards. So even they were sort of operating these sort of standards and the sort of the code that had emerged there. Okay, which is also, I think, very striking. But I was talking about averages. The idea is that, in general, apparently, a lot of us in similar situations will do similar things. That's the idea. Okay? Just as in similar situations, some will refuse. Okay? But the trouble is, and this is something that Zimbardo also tries to point out, it's very hard to predict who will be a hero and who will be an accessory, who will be a perpetrator. Okay? And his advice is sort of to be on guard, to think critically. But, well, it remains to be seen, of course. Okay. Does that sort of answer your question? Okay. We have 2 more reactions. One from, I'm not sure who was first. I think you were first, and then, or let's just pass on the microphone. I think it's the easiest way. Alberto, your reaction first.
Yeah, it's just a short reaction to Gijs. Yeah, I actually agree with him that. Well, wait. Let's just say it differently. I think that anyone can turn evil. First off, so I think the 12 people actually said they felt guilty for not doing things. I think that's because evil and fascism, which is evil, is very contextual. And what happened in the run towards the Second World War was this whole new paradigm which was created. And I think that is why everyone could become a killer, because it depends on the paradigm you live in mentally. And I think it's the people
we'll come back to that
in a way that are, well, I wouldn't say smarter, that sounds demeaning, but more capable of analyzing the rights and the wrongs in a way, in a general level, would be the ones that have this bad feeling with killing, and would be the 12 that refused. I think that's very, it might sound very bad of me to say that, but it depends very much on intellect, I believe.
Okay, right. So even there is a sort of coincidence that who will turn into a hero, right? Okay.
You mentioned several times that the people kept up their self-image as having been a coward in that situation from the 12 people. How do you explain that after 20 years they are still in this role? Because normally society now we would say, well, brave and great job that you didn't participate. So is there an explanation why? Because that's another social norm and another way to look at them, but still they maintain this 20-year-old
good question.
Norm.
Right. How is it possible even after 20 years they still sort of operate the norms that were operating then, basically?
When the norm that evolved in society is totally the opposite.
Yeah. I'm not sure. It probably has to do with the, let's say, the extremity of the situation, in which there was a sort of very special kind of group feeling that apparently was very strong. And you hear this from other sources also in different contexts, but of context of war, is that apparently situations of war do create a very strange dynamic in battalions and groups, in military groups, etc., that can be very powerful. And that can sort of demand a very strong sort of sense, or command a very strong sense of loyalty, and that can endure for a very long time. I think, the loyalty among soldiers, even after a war, if you think about war veterans, etc., they still feel very loyal to each other, even if, when the war has been over for 20 years. So I guess it plays into that, a sense of loyalty to your brothers, basically, in that situation. And even if you call yourself a coward, you're still sort of attesting that there is a sense of loyalty that you have to that group. That would be my explanation, but I could be wrong. But let's see the reactions. Yeah.
Isn't that just...
quick reaction, then we'll move to you. All right.
Yeah, just quickly. Isn't that just identity? Like, if you would let go of that norm or that loyalty, who are you?
Right. That's another part, sure. It helped in building up who you are. It's part of your history. If you just had to accept that you were actually operating a totally erroneous norm, it's very hard to accept that. People stick to what they were. Yes, but for a very short time, but a very impressive and very strong and very important defining time, I would say. Yeah. Yes.
I think it's pretty hard for us to say something about that after 20 years they still feel the same way, because we don't know in which way the questions were asked. Because it could be, how did you feel when you deserted the battalion? And then they could say, well, I felt like a coward. And how do you perceive yourself now? And maybe they answered, well, I don't feel it that consciously anymore, but then I was a coward. We can't say if they still feel like a coward, right? Because we don't know what the questions were.
That's possible, sure. It's possible that they... but I was just thinking about this sense of loyalty that emerged. You can even see it doesn't really take that much time, and that far extreme situations. If you look at all the reality shows about groups where people are being voted out, if you see even after a week or 2 weeks how closely knit people can become, and when someone has to leave, that they're very tearful, etc. You see how strong and how quickly this kind of bond can emerge, I guess. Of course, this is a different level, but it's just to show how strong group dynamics and how quickly they can actually develop. All right. Okay, Patricia, I hope that sort of answers your question. Feel free to sort of react. But let me just turn back to the criticism of Adorno. Bauman would say, okay, so it's not a question of authoritarian personality. Why? Because evil and perpetratorship is not a question of on the individual level. It's not a question of personality. It's a question of social dynamics. Okay, so cruelty is social. It has to do with the roles that we play in a social context. Okay, and then of course Browning, also takes that cue because he looks at all kinds of social conditions and social factors that contributed to these battalion members becoming killers. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. But what is clear here is that sociology and psychology diverge. Okay? What Bauman is really making a sociological argument against the psychological argument of Adorno. Okay, saying, no, if you want to explain this, you have to look at it on a social level or a sociological level, not on a psychological level. Okay? I think Browning, to a large extent, also sort of opts much more for this sociological level. He doesn't really believe the idea that psychological explanation is really a valid explanation for what happened. Sociological explanations are much more powerful, I think he would say. Okay? So there's a Nazi ideology. We've discussed most of this, so I'm going to skip through this quite quickly. There was a sort of indoctrination. They were giving anti-Semitic writings, etc. There was a construction of a threat, of course, the threat of sort of the Jewish takeover, the Jews as the enemy, the Jews as the killer of Christ, Christianity. The question of St. Paul, the Jew actually took over Christianity, hijacked it and sort of used it to serve Jewish ends, etc. The critique of liberalism, the whole sense of equality was actually, the whole ideology of equality was launched by the inferiors who actually wanted to get on top. And behind that, of course, were the Jews. Once again, liberalism is a Jewish invention. That's typical Nazi ideology. Of course, Marxism, one of the other enemies besides Judaism. But of course, who's the founder of Marxism? Marx, he was a Jew. So it all sort of comes together in this huge sort of conspiracy theory, basically, okay? And of course, it taps into the general anti-Semitism that was already there, okay? Apparently, the age of the people also mattered. Browning sort of made some investigations into the general age. That also played a role, okay? And once again, this is just going back to the distanciation, the alienation of the Jews. Okay, they were actually exiled from society, isolated. They already lived in these separate villages, so it was quite easy to sort of start to look at them as non-humans and aliens who had to be exterminated. And of course the idea, I'll be right there, Suzanne, the idea that the Jews were actually planning a sort of takeover of society. They were planning to conquer the world. Okay, if you think of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is still around, regrettably, the idea that the Jews are actually planning to very insidiously take over the world and subjugate the whole world to Judaism. Okay, that was another idea that was sort of implanted. Suzanne, we have a question.
Yes, we have another question from Ernest.
Ernest, good. Thank you.
Yes.
You're still here. Great.
And I'll just read it out. He's saying, Browning has emphasized that Hitler's enthusiasm brought together all kinds of people. Eugenists who wanted to achieve racial purity, and to a large extent he says that specific ideas and plans did not come from Hitler but from his subordinates. Do you think those second-level Nazi leaders think, like Himmler, should be held responsible as Hitler for the Holocaust?
Wow, that's another huge question. So the question is, do the, let's say, the second in command, people like Himmler, also top dogs, who also had their own specific ideas of racial purity, anti-Semitism, etc., are they just as responsible for the Holocaust as Hitler himself? Okay, so it's a very huge question, Patricia, so it will probably take me a couple of weeks, I guess, but let's see if there's any sort of attempt at, okay, some people we haven't seen yet, so good, or heard. All right, let's start here and then we'll give the microphone to you. Yes?
I do think they are as responsible, especially because what he already said, that people, those people had their own ideas and they developed their own theories and what should happen to the Jews, and it's not like they were, pushed to do things they didn't want to.
Right.
So they are as responsible and maybe even more.
Okay, maybe even more. Why would you say maybe even more?
Because they are still the people who develop the plans and the ideas, and
right. So they were sort of aiding and abetting and
Yeah.
sort of accessories. Okay, good point. Thank you. Okay. All right. Oh, we forgot to mention your name. Could you just say who you are, just so that Patricia knows?
Megan. I think it doesn't really matter whether who's more responsible or not. They all participate in something awful. So for me, they're equally responsible.
Okay.
I mean, I don't. Of course, there are grades in. I mean, what you do and what you didn't. But in the end, it all comes down on, well, evil, if you want to call it like that. So.
Okay. Good. Good point. Thank you. All right. Any more reactions? Okay. I hope that's helpful, Suzanne. It's not Suzanne, Patricia. I mean, you're channeling. It's a huge question, right? But I hope that's sort of more or less helpful. Let me just go on because I see that we're still closely coming to the close. See if I'm just going to skip and actually come to what I also, according to Alkeline, is really the most important part. See, we had a quite large. I'm just going to skip this. Actually, there was a quote from Himmler, which maybe let me just sort of focus on that for a moment. Is that, especially from on the upper tiers, among people like Himmler, the top dogs, etc., there was very much the sense that the killing of the Jews was a historical task. Okay, it was a question basically of sort of very general historical justice, a process of justice that the Jews should be exterminated in order to bring sort of the perfect world order into being. And you see that there is a sort of moral reasoning about the necessity of the killing. And you see, I mean, to some extent that Adorno does have a point with the authoritarian personality. This is from a speech by Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, where he sort of envisages his own task. He says, "I believe, gentlemen, that you know me well enough to know that I am not a bloodthirsty man." So he says, I'm pretty ordinary myself. Nor that a man that enjoys the rough decisions I had and have to take. Not a man that enjoys the rough decisions that I have and had to take. I am a man with guts and a sense of duty, so that when I see something that necessarily has to be done, I inexorably have to carry it out. Okay, so you see that gradually, there's a shift in what he's saying, but he's almost turning himself into a sort of instrument of history. I have no other choice. This is dynamic of history. We are the master race, after all, so I become the instrument of this sort of historical dynamic. And this was, Himmler was not the only one. There were more people actually sort of thinking in that way. Okay, it's a very short question because I really...
Is that what you mean when they say the Kantian thinking of...
okay, right. I was actually going to... Yeah. Is this Kantian thinking? Well, good question. Well, what do you think? Do you think this is a sort of a variety of the categorical imperative? Right, let's have a microphone first. We discussed the ethical theories, Ernest, of Immanuel Kant and the categorical imperative. And the question is whether you could sort of construe Himmler's remarks as a sort of very strange version of the categorical imperative. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think within the normative system of that ideology, that is a categorical imperative.
It's certainly a historical imperative, I would say. I'm not sure if it does sort of point towards a certain sense of universalization, I agree. But I'm not sure if it's a universalization that Kant would sort of entertain. But you are right that it does come very close in a very eerie way.
He would carry it out nonetheless, no matter what, just because it must be done.
Right.
And not for the end, but really...
Yeah, I'm not sure if he's really talking about an intrinsic end. It almost seems as if it is, but I would say that this is sort of a very inflated version of a hypothetical imperative to bring it closer to a sort of categorical. But I'm not sure Kant would say it really gets there. Okay, but you're very right. I was also struck by the parlance of duty, the whole rhetoric that he actually uses. Actually, another very famous Nazi, Eichmann, actually invoked the categorical imperative. We'll come back to that when we go to the text of Hannah Arendt in a couple of weeks. But you can see it's eerie. I would agree. Yes, absolutely. Let me just move on. I know there's another question, but let me just sort of wrap up my story here. I'm just going to skip this too. I want to turn to a theory that is very important for Goffman. Because what Browning basically, the point that he tries to make is that the perpetrators were ordinary men. Okay, there's a kind of casualness about it. Okay, so and all of our attempts to sort of make these people extraordinary and finding extraordinary explanations just break down. And that's the most distressing thing, I think. Okay, and we still have the tendency to do that. Okay, even if you look at the reporting on the killing in Alphen aan de Rijn, for example, the first thing that happens is that we try to sort of distantiate ourselves from the perpetrator. He was a nutcase. He was into weapons. He was a gun nut, etc., etc. As long as he doesn't resemble us, we feel safe. But precisely what Browning is trying to show, using a couple of other theories, is that basically he's actually very close, and that we have these mechanisms. Okay, and one of the interesting theories to explain this sort of mechanism is the theory of Irving Goffman, a very famous American sociologist. If I'm not mistaken, he was the one who actually translated a lot of the work of Max Weber into English and introduced it in the United States. Okay, so he played a very important role in that respect as well. He developed a theory called symbolic interactionism, which actually derives a lot from dramaturgy, from theater, okay, from the dramatic arts, in the sense that he tries to make the point that in a lot of what we're doing, almost in everything we're doing, we're always playing a role, as if we're on a stage. Other people are spectators and we are actors. Okay, so that's the basic intuition of his theory. People are actors. We're always doing what he calls impression management. Okay? And you're doing this now, I'm doing this now, wherever you are, if you're on a bus, if you're at home with your parents, etc., you're constantly playing certain roles, you're switching roles from one context to another, and you're continually engaging in this impression management. Okay? You're monitoring how your impression comes across, you're adapting it, you're playing with it, etc., which also, of course, means that you can distantiate yourself from that role you're playing. Okay? You never coincide with the role you're playing. You can always sort of, the fact that you can adapt it, you can change it, means that you don't coincide with it. Okay? And this is what he calls a very important notion, role distance. Okay? It's a very famous notion in sociology. And Goffman really coined that notion. It means that we can actually distantiate ourselves from our roles, from the role that we are playing. A very famous example he gives is when you force a teenager to go on a merry-go-round. Okay? What happens, of course, if you really force him or her, what he will do is sort of make it very clear that this is not the position he or she wants to be in. She'll sit backwards and say, oh God, I'm really having fun, something like that. That's role distance. You're distantiating yourself from the role that you're expected to play. Okay, and you can probably find a lot of other instances. For example, also a waiter who's looking very bored and who's saying, I'm just doing this to get through college, I'm just doing this to make a buck. You're distantiating yourself. This is not really me. This is a role I'm playing. Okay? Now, this is something that Browning also uses in his account of the perpetratorship. Because in the interrogations, in the documents, the records, you see that these perpetrators also engage in this kind of thing by saying, well, I was just playing this role. I had to do my duty. Okay? I didn't really want to do it, but the situation required this of me. I had to play this role. Okay? So you see this role distancing, and it's a very important mechanism, but it's a very ambiguous mechanism. It can be, it's very sort of essential in order to be professional. Okay? If you're working for a certain organization, you know that people get in trouble when they start to identify with their role. Okay? And you always have to be aware of doing that. But that temptation is always there. Okay? So it's a very important basic distinction that Goffman makes, doing versus being. Okay? It's your role that you're playing. And there's always a difference between what you really are. Why? Because you can assume different roles. So you don't coincide with any of your roles. And you see that Rudolf Hess, one of the architects of the Holocaust, made a very sort of strange elaboration on that by saying, well, we were sort of continually trying to approach this ideal of ourselves, which was basically the Nazi ideal, of course. And this also, of course, taps in with how the perpetrators try to sort of justify their behavior. Okay? Let me just go a little deeper into the theory of Goffman, because it's really so important. We have to, I think I have one more sheet, and then I'm done. Suzanne, great. It also involves a certain anthropological stance, a sort of interpretation of what human beings are. And according to Goffman, human beings are precisely creatures that create meaning. We are continually creating meaning to ourselves and to others. And what is very important, not only for Goffman, but also for Milgram, and Browning refers to Milgram, is that if we're playing a role, what is very determinative is the kind of play we think we're in. And that's where authorities can play a very major role, because they can define the situation, they can define the context that we are acting in. Okay? Browning refers to this, I think, literally, the definition of the situation. Very important. Think of the Milgram experiment. Okay, it's the guy in the white coat, etc., who really defines the situation. He's a figure of authority. And if you're in charge of defining the situation, you can actually force people to do a lot of things they wouldn't normally do. Okay, so it's always I think it's good advice to always be aware of who is defining the situation here, and who is in charge, who has the authority. Okay, so this is really important for Milgram, but also in giving an account of this perpetratorship. Okay. Let's see. This is a final sort of couple of remarks. Let me end with this as a final sentence of Browning as well. His question is, if we find, as we have found out, that these people are completely ordinary, if they can sort of reach this level at which they start doing major killings, what group cannot be brought so far by an authority that can define the situation? So the message is, be aware of who is defining the situation, basically. You'll also find this in Zimbardo, who sort of elaborates on the Milgram experiment. Okay? That's it, just 1 minute late. Great. Thanks to all the people online, if you're still there. Thanks to all of you. Right? You can give yourself an applause, that's a good thing. I'll give you an applause as well. Thanks very much for all the questions, and we hope to see some of you in Tilburg at some point. Okay, thank you. And bye, Alkeline, as well.